The morning sun cast long shadows across the training mats at Precision Combat Academy, where the sound of grunts and slapping feet echoed through the converted warehouse. Sarah Martinez had been coming here for 6 months, ever since she decided that working as a software engineer wasn't enough anymore. She wanted to feel strong, capable, ready for anything life might throw at her. At 28, Sarah was petite but determined. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a tight ponytail during training, and her brown eyes held a fierce concentration that surprised even her instructors. She had started with basic self-defense classes, but her natural ability and dedication quickly caught the attention of Marcus Chen, the head instructor and former MMA fighter. "You've got real potential, Sarah," Marcus had told her just last week. "Your technique is getting solid, and your mind stays calm under pressure. That's rare." Today was different, though. Today, Marcus had invited some of his old training partners to join the advanced sparring session. Sarah felt nervous butterflies in her stomach as she wrapped her hands, watching the newcomers stretch and warm up. They were bigger, more experienced, and she could tell from their movements that they had been fighting for years. "Don't worry about it," whispered Jenny, Sarah's usual sparring partner. "Just stay relaxed and remember what Marcus taught us about distance and timing." Among the visiting fighters was Jake Morrison, a bulky man in his early 30s with thick arms covered in tattoos. He had the swagger of someone who had won more fights than he had lost, and Sarah noticed how he looked at the women in the class with a mixture of amusement and dismissal. When Marcus announced the sparring rotations, Jake's eyes landed on Sarah. "Looks like I'm up with the computer girl," Jake said with a smirk that made Sarah's jaw tighten. Marcus frowned. "Jake, this is technical sparring. Keep it controlled and focus on technique." "Sure thing, coach," Jake replied, but something in his tone suggested he had other plans. As they faced each other on the mat, Sarah tried to calm her racing heart. She had sparred with men before, including some who were much larger than her, but there was something about Jake that felt different. His stance was aggressive, his eyes held a cold intensity, and when they touched gloves, his grip lingered just a moment too long. "Go easy on me," Sarah said, trying to keep things light. Jake's response was a harsh laugh. "We'll see how tough you really are." The first few minutes went normally enough. They circled each other, throwing light jabs and practicing defensive movements. Sarah felt herself settling into the rhythm, her training taking over. She landed a clean counter-punch to Jake's ribs and saw his expression darken. "Lucky shot," he muttered. But as the round continued, Jake's intensity increased. His punches came harder and faster, forcing Sarah to work much more defensively than she was comfortable with. She could see Marcus watching from the corner of the mat, his expression growing concerned. "Time!" Marcus called, but Jake seemed not to hear. He pressed forward with a hard combination that forced Sarah to duck and weave desperately. "Time!" Marcus called again, louder this time, and Jake finally stopped, breathing hard. During the rest period, Sarah noticed Jake talking quietly with one of his friends, shooting glances in her direction. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. "You okay?" Jenny asked, handing her a water bottle. "Yeah, just getting warmed up," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. When the second round began, Jake's demeanor had changed completely. Gone was any pretense of technical sparring. He came forward like a predator, throwing combinations with bad intentions. Sarah found herself backing up constantly, struggling to keep up with the pace. "Slow it down, Jake," Marcus called from the sideline, but Jake either didn't hear or didn't care. Sarah managed to slip a hard right hand and countered with an uppercut that snapped Jake's head back. For a split second, she thought she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. Then everything changed. Jake surged forward, abandoning all pretense of boxing. He grabbed Sarah around the waist and drove her backwards toward the wall. Sarah's training kicked in and she tried to sprawl to defend the takedown, but Jake was too strong and too determined. They hit the mat hard with Jake on top, and Sarah immediately began working to escape. She had practiced this position hundreds of times, but Jake wasn't following any of the rules they had learned. Instead of working for a submission or trying to improve his position, he was using his weight to pin her down, making it hard for her to breathe. "What are you doing?" Sarah gasped. Trying to create space. Jake's response was to shift his weight forward, pressing down on her chest and throat. "Let's see how tough you really are when you can't breathe." Panic began to creep into Sarah's mind as she realized this wasn't sparring anymore. Jake's forearm was across her throat, and he was applying pressure that had nothing to do with any legitimate wrestling technique. She tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. The other students had stopped their own training to watch, but the scene looked enough like normal grappling that most didn't realize what was happening. Sarah's vision started to blur as the pressure on her throat increased. Through the growing haze, she heard Marcus shouting something, his voice seeming to come from very far away. She tried desperately to remember her escape techniques, but Jake's weight and position made everything she had learned seem useless. Just as darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision, Sarah saw a figure moving quickly across her peripheral vision. Someone was approaching the mat with purpose, but Jake seemed oblivious, focused entirely on maintaining his crushing grip. The last thing Sarah remembered clearly was the sound of approaching footsteps and a voice that cut through the air like a knife, calm but carrying absolute authority. "That's enough." Two simple words that seemed to freeze everything in the room, spoken by someone who clearly expected immediate obedience. Sarah felt the pressure on her throat ease slightly as Jake looked up, his expression changing from cruel satisfaction to something that might have been surprise or recognition. As oxygen slowly returned to her lungs, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the man standing at the edge of the mat. He was not particularly tall or imposing at first glance, with sandy brown hair and the kind of quiet presence that didn't demand attention, but somehow commanded it anyway. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and when they fixed on Jake, Sarah saw the bigger man's entire demeanor change. "I said that's enough," the stranger repeated, stepping onto the mat with the fluid movements of someone completely comfortable with violence. "Let her up." Jake's grip loosened, but his expression remained defiant. "This is just sparring, buddy. Mind your own business." The stranger's response was barely above a whisper, but every person in the room heard it clearly. "Trust me, you want to make this my business." Jake slowly released his grip on Sarah's throat, but he didn't move off her. Instead, he kept his position while turning to face the newcomer with a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Look, I don't know who you think you are," Jake said, trying to inject authority into his voice. "But this is between me and her. We're just training." Sarah gasped as air flowed back into her lungs, her hands instinctively going to her neck. She could see Marcus pushing through the other students to reach the mat, his face a mixture of anger and concern. The stranger stepped closer, his movement so fluid and controlled that it seemed almost casual. But there was something predatory about it, like a wolf circling prey. "Training," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Is that what you call putting pressure on someone's carotid artery until they lose consciousness?" "It's called grappling," Jake replied, but Sarah could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Maybe you've heard of it." A thin smile crossed the stranger's lips, but there was no warmth in it whatsoever. "I've heard of it. I've also heard of assault. The question is, which one are we dealing with here?" Jake finally climbed off Sarah, helping her to a sitting position, though she could tell it was more for show than out of any genuine concern. "Like I said, just training. Right, Sarah?" Sarah looked up at Jake, then at the stranger, who was now standing directly between them. Up close, she could see the man was probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of lean muscle that came from functional fitness rather than gym workouts. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but she noticed they were heavily scarred, with calluses that spoke of years of serious training. "Sarah doesn't need to say anything," the stranger said quietly. "I saw what I needed to see." Marcus finally reached the mat, his face flushed with exertion and anger. "Jake, what the hell was that? That wasn't sparring." "Come on, Marcus," Jake replied, some of his confidence returning with backup present. "She wanted to train with the big boys. Sometimes that means learning what real pressure feels like." "Real pressure?" The stranger's voice remained calm, but something in his tone made several students take an unconscious step backward. "You want to talk about real pressure?" Before anyone could respond, the stranger moved. It happened so fast that most people didn't see the individual motions, just the result. One moment, Jake was standing confidently next to Sarah. The next, he was face down on the mat, with his arm twisted behind his back at what looked like a very uncomfortable angle. "This is real pressure," the stranger said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather. "Can you feel the difference?" Jake tried to struggle, but every movement seemed to make his position worse. "Let go of me! You can't just attack people!" "Attack?" The stranger sounded genuinely puzzled. "I thought we were just training. Isn't that what you said? Sometimes training means learning what real pressure feels like." Sarah watched in fascination as Jake's earlier bravado crumbled completely. The man who had seemed so intimidating just moments before was now whimpering into the mat, unable to move without causing himself significant pain. "Please," Jake gasped. "You're going to break my arm." "Am I?" the stranger asked mildly. "I'm just applying basic joint manipulation techniques. Nothing you shouldn't be able to handle if you're such an experienced fighter." Marcus stepped forward, his expression conflicted. "Look, I appreciate you helping Sarah, but maybe we should—" "Should what?" the stranger interrupted, though his tone remained respectful. "Should let him up so he can explain why choking out training partners is acceptable behavior? Should pretend that what he did to this young woman was normal sparring?" "It wasn't normal sparring," Marcus admitted, shooting a disgusted look at Jake. "But maybe we can handle this without—" "Without what? Without consequences?" The stranger adjusted his grip slightly, and Jake let out a sharp cry. "Tell me, Marcus, what would you have done if I hadn't been here? What would have happened to Sarah?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see the other students watching with wide eyes, the women in particular seeming to understand the implications of what they had witnessed. "I would have stopped it," Marcus said, but even he didn't sound entirely convinced. "When?" the stranger pressed. "After she lost consciousness? After he decided he was done proving his point? Or were you hoping he would show some self-control and stop before it went too far?" Sarah struggled to her feet, her throat still tender but her thinking clearing. "What's your name?" she asked the stranger. He looked at her for the first time since the confrontation began, and she was struck by the intelligence in those pale eyes. "David. David Rodriguez." "David," Sarah repeated. "Thank you. But maybe you could let him up now. I think he got the message." David studied her for a moment, then looked down at Jake, who was still pinned helplessly to the mat. "Did you get the message, Jake?" "Yes," Jake gasped. "Yes, I got it. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" David's voice remained conversational. For taking it too far. For hurting Sarah." David made a small adjustment to his hold, and Jake yelped. "That's not quite right. Try again." "For assaulting her," Jake said quickly. "For assaulting Sarah during what was supposed to be training." "Better." David released the hold and stepped back, allowing Jake to roll over and clutch his arm. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. You're not going to come back to this gym. And if I ever hear about you treating another training partner the way you treated Sarah today, we're going to have a much longer conversation. Are we clear? Jake climbed unsteadily to his feet, his face red with humiliation and pain. You can't ban me from here? You don't even train here. David tilted his head slightly. You're right. I don't train here. He looked at Marcus. But I'm guessing the owner of this establishment might have some thoughts about students who assault other students. Marcus nodded firmly. Jake, you're done here. Pack your stuff and go. This is bullshit, Jake muttered, but he was already moving toward his gym bag. That guy attacked me. Everyone saw it. What everyone saw, Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, was someone stopping you from choking me unconscious. If you want to call that an attack, maybe you should think about what that says about what you were doing to me. Jake's face darkened, but one look at David's calm expression seemed to drain the fight out of him. He grabbed his belongings and headed for the exit, his friends trailing behind him with apologetic looks. As the gym slowly returned to normal activity, David turned his attention back to Sarah. How are you feeling? Any dizziness or nausea? I'm okay, Sarah said, though she was still rubbing her throat. A little shaken up, but okay. Good. You might want to have a doctor check your throat just to be safe, and you might consider filing a police report. Sarah looked around at the other students, most of whom were trying to pretend they weren't listening. I don't know. It would be my word against his. Not exactly, David said. You've got about 20 witnesses, plus whatever security cameras this place has. He gestured toward the corners of the room. Marcus nodded. We record all the training sessions for insurance purposes. If you want copies, Sarah, just let me know. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't even thought about the cameras. Thank you, both of you. I don't know what would have happened if... Don't think about that, David interrupted gently. What matters is that you're safe, and that guy won't be bothering anyone else here. Can I ask you something? Sarah said. That takedown you used, that wasn't just basic martial arts, was it? David's expression became carefully neutral. I've had some training. What kind of training? For a moment, David seemed to be weighing his words. Finally, he said, the kind that teaches you to recognize threats and neutralize them quickly. Marcus, who had been listening to the exchange, stepped closer. David, I don't think we've met. Are you new to the area? Just visiting, David replied. I was actually looking for someone to train with while I'm in town. I heard this was a good place. It is, Marcus said firmly, shooting a look toward the exit where Jake had disappeared. Or at least it's supposed to be. That kind of thing doesn't usually happen here. I'm sure it doesn't, David said. You run a professional operation, but sometimes predators look for places where they can blend in with legitimate training. The word predators hung in the air, and Sarah realized that David had seen something in Jake's behavior that went beyond just overly aggressive sparring. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Well, Marcus said, clearly trying to lighten the mood, if you're looking for training partners, you're welcome to stick around. We've got some good people here. David looked at Sarah. What do you think? Ready to get back on the mat? Sarah hesitated for a moment, then squared her shoulders. Actually, yes, I am. And as she looked into David's calm, steady eyes, she realized that she meant it. 3 weeks had passed since the incident with Jake, and the atmosphere at Precision Combat Academy had noticeably improved. Word had spread quickly through the local martial arts community about what happened, and several students had approached Sarah to thank her for standing up to someone who, as it turned out, had a reputation for aggressive behavior at other gyms. David had indeed stuck around, and his presence had transformed the training environment in ways no one could have predicted. Despite his quiet demeanor, he brought an intensity and precision to every session that elevated everyone around him. Sarah found herself looking forward to training days more than ever before. Your footwork is getting much better, David said as they finished a technical drilling session. You're starting to move like you believe in yourself. Sarah smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead. I have a good teacher, although I still don't know much about my teacher. Over the past 3 weeks, David had shared very little about his background. He was visiting from San Diego, he said, taking some time off work. When pressed about what kind of work he did, he would give vague answers about government contracting, but his skills spoke volumes about his training. What do you want to know? David asked, beginning to unwrap his hands. Well, for starters, where did you learn to move like that? The way you handled Jake wasn't just martial arts. That was something else entirely. David was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Around them, other students were packing up their gear and heading home, but Sarah sensed this conversation was important. I spent 8 years in the Navy, David said finally. Special operations. We learned to handle situations where hesitation could get people killed. Navy SEALs, Sarah said. It wasn't really a question. David nodded. Among other things. When I saw what Jake was doing to you, my training kicked in. In my world, someone who uses their physical advantages to hurt people who can't defend themselves is called a threat, and threats get neutralized. Is that why you left? The Navy, I mean. David's expression darkened slightly. I didn't leave voluntarily. I was medically retired after an operation went sideways in Afghanistan. Took some shrapnel to my leg and back. Doctors said I'd never be fit for active duty again. Sarah looked down at David's legs, but couldn't see any obvious signs of injury. You seem to move fine. Physical therapy is a wonderful thing. But there's a difference between being able to function and being able to hump a pack through the mountains for days on end. David's tone was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the underlying frustration. So what are you doing now? Trying to figure that out, David admitted. I've been traveling, seeing the country, thinking about what comes next. The military is all I've known since I was 18. Starting over at 34 isn't exactly what I had planned. Marcus approached them, having finished locking up the equipment. David, Sarah, I wanted to talk to you both about something. They looked at him expectantly. I've been thinking about what happened with Jake, and about how we can prevent something like that from happening again. Sarah, would you be interested in helping me develop a women's self-defense program? Something focused on practical skills rather than traditional martial arts? Sarah's eyes lit up. That sounds amazing. But I don't know if I'm qualified to teach anything. That's where David comes in, Marcus continued. I was hoping you might be willing to help design the curriculum. Your background gives you a perspective on real-world threats that most martial arts instructors don't have. David looked thoughtful. What kind of program are you thinking about? Something that teaches situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and physical skills for when those don't work. Too many self-defense classes teach elaborate techniques that fall apart under stress. I want something practical. That makes sense, David said. Most people don't realize that the best self-defense technique is avoiding dangerous situations entirely. But when you can't avoid them, you need simple, effective tools. Sarah found herself getting excited about the possibility. We could start with basic awareness exercises. Teach people to recognize predatory behavior before it escalates. Exactly, Marcus agreed. Sarah, your experience with Jake could help other women recognize those warning signs. And David, your tactical background could help us design realistic training scenarios. Over the next hour, they outlined a comprehensive program that would combine psychological preparation with physical skills. David brought up concepts like the ODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, and how it applied to personal protection. Sarah contributed insights about the subtle signs she had missed with Jake and how they might teach others to spot them earlier. There's something else, David said as they were wrapping up. Sarah, You might consider getting your concealed carry permit. Sarah blinked in surprise. A gun? I don't know anything about guns. That's exactly why you should learn, David replied. I'm not saying you should carry one, but understanding firearm safety and basic marksmanship is another tool in the toolkit. Knowledge is never a bad thing. Marcus nodded. There are some excellent instructors in the area. David, would you be willing to help with that too? If Sarah's interested, sure. But it's her choice. Sarah thought about it for a moment. 3 weeks ago, the idea of learning to shoot would have seemed absurd. Now, after experiencing firsthand how quickly a situation could turn dangerous, she found herself more open to the idea. Let's start with the self-defense program, she said, but I'd like to learn about firearms too. Maybe not carry one, but at least understand them. Good attitude, David said approvingly. The goal isn't to turn you into a warrior, it's to give you options so you never feel helpless again. As they prepared to leave the gym, Sarah realized how much her life had changed in just 3 weeks. The incident with Jake, terrifying as it had been, had opened doors she never would have considered before. She was stronger, more confident, and more aware of both the dangers and opportunities around her. David, she said, as they reached the parking lot, I have one more question. Shoot. Are you planning to stick around? I mean, after we get this program set up? David paused beside his truck, keys in hand. I was thinking about it. San Diego will always be there, but this feels like something worth doing. Plus, I like the people here. Sarah smiled. Even after seeing us at our worst? Especially after seeing you at your worst, David replied seriously. What happened with Jake was scary, but how you handled it afterward showed real character. You could have let it break you, make you afraid to train. Instead, you turned it into motivation to help other people. That's the kind of courage they don't teach in the military. As Sarah drove home that night, she reflected on the strange turns life could take. A few months ago, she had been a software engineer who thought self-defense meant checking the locks on her apartment door. Now she was planning to help teach other women to protect themselves, working with a former Navy SEAL who had appeared at exactly the right moment to change everything. She touched her throat gently, where the bruises from Jake's grip had long since faded. The physical marks were gone, but the lesson remained. She had learned that predators existed in places where you least expected them, but she had also learned that protectors existed too. Sometimes they came in unexpected packages, with quiet voices and pale blue eyes, carrying skills forged in distant wars, but willing to use them to defend a stranger in a small-town gym. Most importantly, she had learned that she could be both, someone who needed protection and someone who could provide it. The victim and the defender, the student and the teacher, the person who got knocked down and the person who helped others get back up. When David had said, "That's enough," on that mat 3 weeks ago, he hadn't just been talking to Jake. He had been talking to the part of Sarah that was willing to accept being victimized, the part that would have made excuses for Jake's behavior or blamed herself for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That person was gone now, replaced by someone stronger and more aware. Someone who understood that real strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the willingness to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The following week, Precision Combat Academy announced its new women's self-defense program, designed and taught by a former software engineer and a retired Navy SEAL. The first class filled up within hours of registration opening, with a waiting list that stretched for months. Sarah never did find out exactly what brought David to their gym that day, whether it was coincidence or something else entirely. But as she watched him patiently explain de-escalation techniques to a room full of women who had their own stories of feeling vulnerable and afraid, she decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that when someone needed help, he had been there. And now, because of what he had taught her, she would be there for the next person who needed it. The circle of protection grew wider, one student at a time, built on the foundation of 2 words, spoken with absolute authority in a moment of crisis. That's enough. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.